Here's something that should make you deeply uncomfortable. There is a $3.5 trillion pool of money sitting underneath Australia. Not in the ground, not in a vault, in a system that most Australians interact with once a year. When they glance at their super statement, squint at a number they don't fully understand, and then go back to whatever they were doing. And the thing is, that money is yours. Technically, eventually, supposedly. But between now and when you actually get your hands on it, it passes through a system so complicated, so layered, and so quietly lucrative for everyone except you, that calling it a retirement safety net starts to feel a bit generous. Because superannuation is sold to Australians as the great financial equalizer, the idea is simple. Your employer chips in a percentage of your wage. It compounds over 40 years. You retire comfortable. Brilliant. Easy. Done. And that sounds great. The problem is the part nobody puts in the brochure, which brings us to where we actually are. Because Australia's superannuation system is now the fourth largest pension pool in the entire world, $3.5 trillion. That is more than twice the size of Australia's entire GDP, and it's growing. By 2040, it's projected to hit somewhere between $9 and $10 trillion. So we're not talking about a small program. We're talking about one of the biggest pots of money in the Southern Hemisphere, managed by hundreds of funds, overseen by layers of regulators, and quietly generating billions of dollars in fees every single year. Let that sink in. Because here's the thing about big pots of money. The bigger the pot, the more people show up with ladles. Let's start with the fees, because that's where the polite robbery happens. The average Australian super fund charges somewhere between 0.5% and 2% per year in total fees. Doesn't sound like much, right? It's just a percentage. It's fine. Wrong. It is not fine. Here's the maths that the super fund brochures tend to accidentally forget to mention. If you have $100,000 in super and you're paying 1.5% in annual fees, you're handing over $1,500 a year. Over 40 years, even before compounding effects, that's $60,000. And once you factor in the compounding cost, the returns you didn't earn because that money was taken before it could grow, the actual damage is closer to $200,000 or more over a working life. And that's for one person, with one average balance. Multiply that across 16 million Australians with active super accounts, and you start to understand how fund managers and administrators pull somewhere around $30 billion a year in fees out of the system. Every year, rain or shine, whether markets go up or down, whether you retire rich or scrape by, the fees still land. It's the one subscription you signed up for at birth, can't cancel, and barely know you're paying. Which brings us to the next problem. Because fees alone are uncomfortable, but they're not the time bomb. The time bomb is what's inside the funds themselves. Most Australian super funds, even the ones marketed as balanced or diversified, carry enormous exposure to Australian equities. The ASX is a market dominated by 4 big banks, 2 major mining companies, and a handful of retailers. That's it. That is the diversification you're getting. The ASX accounts for roughly 2% of global market capitalization. 2%. And yet, the average balanced super fund carries around 25 to 30% in Australian shares. So the fund that's supposed to protect your retirement is quietly running a concentrated bet on 4 banks and the iron ore price. And nobody's talking about it. Because as long as the CBA dividend keeps landing and iron ore keeps shipping, everyone gets to feel like diversification is happening. It's a bit like saying you've got a varied diet because sometimes you eat Tim Tams and sometimes you eat shapes. And the home bias doesn't stop at equities. Australian super funds have historically been some of the most heavily allocated to domestic assets of any pension system in the developed world, compared to Canadian, Dutch, or Scandinavian pension funds, which have global infrastructure, private credit, and international equity exposure spread across dozens of markets. Australian super has spent decades betting on Australia. which is fine when Australia's doing well. It's less fine when the thing that's been propping up Australia's economy for 20 years is a housing market running on debt and an iron ore price controlled by a country that's currently building its own domestic steel alternatives. And here's where the historical rhyme starts to kick in. Because this isn't the first time a country built a giant, systemically important financial pool, concentrated it into a small number of domestic assets, told everyone it was safe, and then waited for gravity to show up. Japan in the 1980s had something structurally similar. The Japanese pension system and life insurance industry funneled enormous capital into domestic equities and domestic property. Japanese stocks were trading at 60 times earnings by 1989. The Nikkei peaked at nearly 39,000, and then the bubble popped. The Nikkei spent the next 34 years failing to recover. 34 years. People who were counting on those assets for retirement watched the number go sideways for longer than some of them had left to live. Now, is Australia Japan? No. But does it rhyme? Embarrassingly, yes. Which brings us to the part that nobody in the industry wants to model out loud. The drawdown wave. The baby boomers, Australia's largest generational cohort, are now entering retirement. Between now and 2040, the balance shifts. For decades, superannuation has been a one-way river. Wages go in, compulsory contributions go in, investment returns pile on top, the pool grows, but the river is about to start flowing the other way. Because once a generation starts drawing down super instead of contributing to it, the dynamic reverses. Funds that have spent 40 years buying assets now have to sell them to pay retirees. And when the largest generation in Australian history all starts doing that at roughly the same time, the selling pressure doesn't stay inside the super system. It bleeds into the ASX. It bleeds into property markets. It bleeds into infrastructure assets. And it creates exactly the kind of sustained grinding headwind that looks totally fine until the day it suddenly doesn't. This is the part nobody's saying on the evening news. Not because it's a secret, but because the people who understand it are the same people managing the funds, and they don't get paid to make you panic. They get paid to tell you your balanced option is doing fine. Meet Brad. Brad's 42. He's got about $180,000 in his super. He's in a balanced option. He's paying around 1.2% in fees. He checks his balance once a year, shrugs, and goes back to agonizing over whether to fix or float his mortgage. Brad thinks superannuation is taken care of. Brad is the median Australian. And Brad has absolutely no idea that his diversified fund is 27% concentrated in 4 banks and 2 miners. That he's on track to hand over somewhere north of $150,000 in fees over his working life, and that the asset base his fund relies on is about to face the largest demographic drawdown in Australian history. Brad is not dumb. Brad just assumed someone was watching the pot. So here's what this actually means if you're not Brad, or if you want to stop being Brad. First, look at your fees. Log into your super fund. Find the total annual fee percentage. If it's above 0.85%, start asking uncomfortable questions. Industry super funds generally charge less than retail super funds. The difference over 40 years is not trivial. Second, check your investment option. If you're in your 20s or 30s and you're in a balanced or conservative option, by default, you may be running a lower return strategy during the exact period of your life when compounding growth does its heaviest lifting. Third, understand your fund's asset allocation. Into how much is in Australian equities versus international? Is it 70% domestic? Is there meaningful infrastructure or private credit exposure? These things matter when the ASX has a bad decade. Fourth, understand that industry fund does not automatically mean perfect. Some have outperformed. Some have underperformed. Some have taken on illiquid private asset exposure that looks great in performance tables until you need the money and can't get it. And fifth, pay attention to what happens when $9 trillion starts being drawn down, because that is not a distant hypothetical. That is a demographic calendar. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Superannuation is the most important financial system in Australia that Australians understand the least. The compulsory nature of it, which should be a feature, has quietly become a bug. Because when contributions are mandatory and withdrawal is decades away, people disengage. They treat it like a set-and-forget appliance. They assume someone smart is managing it. And someone is. They're just managing it in a way that's very good for the fund and reasonable to fine for you, depending on the decade, the fees, and the degree to which gravity eventually shows up. The $3.5 trillion isn't going to disappear overnight. This isn't a scam. It's not a fraud. It's not FTX in a suit. But it is a system that, at this scale, carries risks that simply don't show up on a superstatement. Concentration risk, demographic drawdown risk, fee drag risk, and the very human risk of a country full of brads who assume someone else is paying attention. So let me ask you, where do you land on this? Do you think A, Australian super is fundamentally fine, and the demographic drawdown and fee drag is manageable and already being priced in? Or B, the system has enough structural flaws and concentration risk that the next 20 years will be a lot uglier than the super fund brochures are suggesting? Or C, you've never actually looked at your super balance, and you're going to close this video and immediately log in. Drop your take in the comments. And if C, well, welcome to the party. Better late than never.